I am joined by Sam. Sam, welcome to the show. Please introduce yourself.
Hi there, Ryan. I'm Samantha Becker. You could call me Sam. Unless I'm in trouble, then Samantha will do just fine. And I am the founder and CEO of SAB Creative and Consulting, which is a storytelling agency for education. So I work with universities, colleges, K-12 organizations, and nonprofits that are focused on making learning extraordinary and also bolstering access to it.
Fantastic. And we have a lot of entrepreneurs in our audience. We have a lot of students who are practicing public relations. We have some recent graduates. So maybe you can give us some advice to start off with about how you go about the business of attracting clients.
Sometimes the best advice in business is the same advice that hopefully your mother would give you, which is just be yourself. Honestly, I think sometimes people get daunted by just getting started because they may think they need to create a brand that's professional and polished and maybe different than they are. But if you start with your DNA and actually figure out what makes you you and sort of your own superpowers, just finding ways to leverage that in everyday life. Also, as a communicator, being a better listener oftentimes than you are talker, so that you can continually be digesting and understanding people's visions and be kind of synthesizing as you go.
And you spoke about DNA. You also help organizations identify their DNA. Can you speak a little bit about how that magical process is done?
Yes. In the last, however many decades, the word brand sometimes has taken on different connotations and could, have gotten a bad rap. But to me, the brand is what I call the soul of an organization. It's what makes an organization or person unique, how they differentiate from another brand or person, how they speak. I guess this is 2024, so I could say what their general vibe is. Really establishing those key elements of an organization and helping them find their voice is incredibly powerful and exciting to me, because once you unlock a brand's soul and really help them understand and find their voice, then it becomes so much easier for them, regardless of whether they're professional communicators or not, to tell their story and be excited about telling their story and hopefully feel empowered to tell their story.
And there are things that you do as a part of your practice that helps them to empower their storytelling. And you're not talking to everyone. What is your specific niche? Who do you speak to?
That's a great question. I work specifically in the area of education. So I'm personally working with university leaders, technology leaders. I often live at the intersection of learning and digital futures. We talk about increasing access to learning to make sure that everyone has equal opportunity and footing in life. And so that's why access and equity matters so much to me. It's one thing to create amazing learning opportunities and design amazing courses, but who's taking them? Can everyone take them? So it's really about uplifting and making sure everyone is mobilized with the continual education that they need to be successful in whatever, the individual's goals are. So oftentimes, when I'm working with my clients, the audience may be students, prospective students. It could be learners, which I think is really important to pause and define that really quickly. A student is often someone who is seeking a degree, formally enrolled in an institution, but we know that lifelong learning is so important. At least it's been incredibly important for me in my own career and journey. I'm learning every day, Ryan and everyone. So another thing, make sure you're opening yourself up to learn every day. So learners are those that are actually engaging in learning experiences, whether it's flexible, non-degree courses, certificate programs. They may be career professionals looking to get promoted or even switch careers. They may be people going through life transitions. Maybe they've moved through to a new city. So when I am speaking to students, I'm also thinking about learners, and everyone is looking to learn. Another layer of that, of course, is faculty, administrators, whether it's school administrators, university administrators. There's parents to factor in, all kinds of other key stakeholders that, that are really vital to a university space, for example, researchers, scientists. And so it's really about defining who is in your community or who your communities are, and understanding their values and their needs, and making sure that when you are putting out messaging about specific initiatives or brand, that you're really connected with those communities and what resonates with them.
Beautiful answer. And so much to unpack there too. When you're working with these key stakeholders, are there specific tools, frameworks, or strategies that you find useful? Because I know that some of those will apply to other public relations professionals or young professionals that are trying to break in.
I would have to say this may not be a shocking response for those, in communications, but personas are extremely valuable. I call them part of the foundation of any communications and marketing PR, ecosystem or infrastructure. Personas are essentially developing profiles of your community, of the actual people in your community. If you're a startup, it could be maybe you don't necessarily have people in your community yet, but you can do research essentially to build profiles. If you are an established organization or institution, doing interviews, gathering research, understanding stories, those are all things that you can do to develop personas that are actually real. So if you're in a university, for example, I just mentioned a bunch of stakeholders that I work with. So I would have maybe a faculty persona, and it might break that down even further. Let's say it's specifically a science-based initiative, a faculty who teaches science versus a faculty who is interdisciplinary or non-science or doesn't teach science or something else. And the reason to differentiate and really understand who each of those personas and your audiences is so that you can fine-tune messages that better and more deeply resonate with them, that you can connect with them more authentically. And you can also, even beyond communications, you can even shape the initiatives in ways that accommodate and cater better to, faculty vision or perspective. Having a student persona, having an administrator persona allows you to take a core message that you've built and maybe make a few different tweaks, for example, if you're sending out an email, so that you're really connecting with each type of person. One thing to remember, though, is to allow your personas to change and evolve. People change and evolve all the time. That's why research also continually happens. So always revisit those foundational elements of your brand, like personas, even with some of those key stakeholders, and continue to iterate.
This is so beautiful. I full disclosure, I have had the privilege of being trained by you, and hearing you talk about some of these concepts helps to bring that experience back into focus. You talk about the organizational DNA. What's the next step? If we've identified our organizational DNA and we've done a really good job using the frameworks of creating authentic personas with good research tactics, what's the next step for an entrepreneur who's working in public relations?
Well, definitely voice. I mentioned that earlier, but just bringing that back to maybe make it a little bit more concrete. When I talk about voice, so let's say you have your values, what makes you unique. Maybe what makes you unique is what you offer is more flexible. Maybe it reduces the need for other tools, for example. But once you figure that out and you know your audience, that's great. How are you going to communicate in what style to your audience? Are you going to come off as the friendly expert who is very, very informative, but maybe a little serious because that reflects maybe your community based on who you know and the research you've done? Or are you going to be the person that takes complex subjects and puts a playful spin on it, maybe uses a little bit of humor, small doses, whatever it is? Defining your voice and those voice attributes is not all that different from describing a friend or even yourself. So it's like, pretend your brand is your best friend. How would you describe your best friend? You'd probably get excited to stand on a platform and say, my friend is smart, my friend is funny, my friend is extremely kind and always takes time out of their busy day to break down really complex subjects for me, whatever it is. The more that you can see the actual person, the soul of your brand, I think the easier it becomes. And then once you have that in place, you know your style of talking, and that even does reflect, in the graphics, you may build or choose. There's something that I like to call story arcs. They could be called story pillars, story categories. I've heard them called themes. It doesn't so much matter what they're called, but essentially what they are as different ways to understand, organize, and categorize the various impacts that your organization or brand is making. So let's say that you are a school district, for example. This is where you would actually understand, the value that you're adding and the impacts you're making in the community, in society, on your constituents as a school district. Let's say one of them is extraordinary immersive learning experiences or creating those. That's great. That sets you up to make sure that you are perennially telling stories that involve really interesting use cases or outcomes where there's immersive learning experiences. Maybe immersive means virtual reality, augmented reality is used. I've heard immersive also to mean, you're experiential, you're getting maybe on the job training somehow. But the bottom line is once you pick and you understand how the impacts you're making on your community with your community and you define those, it becomes easier to tell stories. Another example of a story arc might be bolstering access and equity. Great. I've talked about that a lot. So that means year round. What are the stories? Did your bus system install high-speed Wi-Fi so that students, going from school back to their rural communities, an hour away can actually successfully do their homework on their buses or work on collaborative projects if they need to? That's a great story to tell. So once you really understand your impacts and you've sort of organized it by categories, then you could really think about the different stories you tell. Something to keep in mind there is your story arcs or themes. They don't exist in a vacuum. So there might be a really good story that encompasses access and equity and also an immersive learning experience. That's great. That means it's an especially powerful story to tell. But just like your voice attributes and your personas, everything should be revisited regularly with your stakeholders and with your team because brands evolve, people evolve, and that's part of DNA actually. So I hope that's helpful.
Absolutely, yes. What you're doing is so bespoke. It's so specific to these organizations and these real people. I know our podcasters, for example, are often studying with finding their voice. And I know that you are really committed to helping uplift the voices of women entrepreneurs. Can you speak a little bit about that kind of work and how it might relate to helping people find their voice?
Yes, that's such a great question. And thank you for asking. One of my passion projects is a group called Sistor, Sisterhood of Storytellers, Sistory. Little wordplay there, go figure. But essentially, it's an open group of women and people who support women. So you don't even need to be a woman or identify as female. Just one of those things that just having a group of people together committed to uplifting women is, just a great thing to have. And so women come together and they talk about, what's going on at their jobs, what they're most excited about, what their pain points are. We often have special speakers. And so it's not so much that specific example. It's the notion of finding space to convene people, to bring yourself together with other people, because it can be really lonely being an entrepreneur and doing it alone. Sometimes you feel like you're in an echo chamber, or sometimes you just need someone to even validate your emotions, right? Things that we kind of take for granted. So just to have an open and candid space where people feel comfortable and safe sharing ends up being a space where people are validating each other and how we feel and what we're dreaming of and what we want. We're also able to find, when people get together, commonalities. People have found jobs, because it's a networking opportunity. And so I just think opening up spaces wherever you can and also participating in those spaces. If you're thinking about joining a community of practice, I think it's one of the best decisions that you can make. A virtual one, it doesn't even need to be in person if you're super busy and balancing work, family, busy mom here. But it's so important to create those spaces and go to those spaces because you will find other people in similar and in different situations that will enrich your lives.
And I love that you have a passion for that. And you also have that passion for storytelling. And we share that passion for storytelling too. When you're talking to that specific woman and giving her advice on how to tell her story, maybe for impact for her business or for her company, what are the specific kinds of frames or advice you might use to help that person develop that voice and develop that story so that it's communicating from a place for authenticity and also demonstrates her power as a speaker?
Before I get into frameworks for storytelling, and there are so many, just starting human to human, from my own life and from nearly every single woman I've encountered. So I feel like this is safe to share this. Almost everyone I've talked to has felt a sense of imposter syndrome at one point or another. So just getting over the hurdle of feeling like you're worthy and you deserve to be in that room and you deserve the opportunity and you're ready for it is actually the biggest hurdle, I think, to surmount oftentimes. And so just reinforcing that the stories that we tell ourselves in our own head, gosh, those are such powerful stories, right? The stories that we tell ourselves that we can't do it, that we're not good enough, that we're not, we don't have enough credentials, that we're not likable enough, that we're not smart enough, that we're not good enough leaders. That's actually a false narrative. And it's a narrative that if you let it get too far in your head, it becomes quite an overpowering story. So if you could find some way to shed that, and I know it's easier said than done, just take this first step and know that by virtue of even having the conversation and having the idea and being who you are absolutely worthy for the opportunity. So step up to the plate. And once you do, finding ways to talk about yourself that gives you a sense of ease and actually makes you feel comfortable and not necessarily drained is really important. Again, it goes back to that notion of really just like harnessing what makes you special and finding ways to be yourself and to be even more of yourself. So then when I talk about frameworks, a couple of really popular ones that I like to use are the hero's journey, which essentially has you discussing a conflict in your life, how you overcame it, and how it got you to where you are now. And you can even hint at why it's going to take you where you're going to go in the future. You could tell a wayfinding story, which is about a time maybe you had a completely different perception of what was going to happen and where you were going to be, whether thrilling or scary, and you're sort of able to tell that story of navigation. By the way, that's pretty much a story everyone can relate to. No one's life is ever in a straight line. And another might be that actually I might recommend more for brands would be a manifesto. Although it is really great to hear when people do it too, but manifesto is more of this is what I believe, this is why I believe it, and this is how I'm going to make that happen. It's really great for a job interview, or even if you're thinking about, if you're applying for a grant or whatever it is. But those are the types of stories that often have a vision in them, maybe a sense of conflict that make there be kind of that sense of tension and actually allow you to get a plot in there in a short amount of time and actually frame your personal story.
In giving people advice on how to craft their manifesto story, where do you see people struggling the most? Because I know that in our podcasting class, they're all of a sudden having to speak, often on camera, maybe for the first time, and staking a flag in the ground saying, this is what I believe. That is a daunting ask. That is a big ask. How can they overcome that to find that story that helps to identify what maybe their show's going to be about or what their client's going to be about?
Great question. Start with your values. What are your personal values? What do you value? Again, I've talked a lot about access and equity. Clearly, that's a value of mine. And so it's easy for me, more seamless to get up there in a soapbox and say, everyone deserves an opportunity for education, right? So it all goes back to your values, and those values are essentially your beliefs, and values are often don't change. So I've talked about, what's perennial, revisit your voice attributes, revisit your personas. Values must be revisited too, but I have to tell you, if your values are changing every year, that's a red flag, right? So just always go back to what you value in life. And especially if you're making a connection with an audience, you're going to want to double click on that shared value, right? Find the value that you share together. So if the audience also values equity, this is your time to get out there. Maybe provide a little bit of data on what access to education looks like, an example of why it needs to change, and then some examples of how you're going to help change it, for an example, is one example, but it always goes back to what's in here, what's in your heart. For those listening, I pointed to my heart.
I love it. That audio description is so important. Thank you. I appreciate that. So, and the other ones, the wayfinding and that whole idea of the hero's journey, where do people struggle the most there? And what advice might you offer for those struggling to find and be a useful wayfinding story or a useful hero's journey story?
Well, first of all, a hero's journey requires you to see yourself as the main character in your own story, which again is sometimes it's a hurdle for many, many people, including myself. And so just putting yourself as the main character in your own story is a really hard thing to do. But if you could think of yourself in your life as a storybook and think about, where you've been and what key memories stand out to you. And when you think about a time in your life when you've felt especially uncomfortable, and maybe that discomfort has led to some personal growth and change or getting a new experience, that story is very worthy of telling. It doesn't have to be some huge story, right? Like you survived a shipwreck, very impressive. Or, you've discovered, some huge scientific discovery. I think it's also about understanding that everyday heroes and everyday main characters, right? Like it's not some big dramatic Netflix story always, and that's okay. It's actually about everyday drama, right? Like, did someone say something to you that made you uncomfortable? Why did it make you feel uncomfortable? So it doesn't have to be so monumental. It's actually about kind of zooming into something that made you feel a certain way and then sharing your process of navigating it. And I think the same could be said for wayfinding. I think some people find wayfinding easier because they don't have to think about the hero necessarily. And so actually when I do exercises where I ask people to pick, I find the most popular when people pick is the wayfinding. But what I do caution with wayfinding is sometimes people use it as a way to chronologically tell like where they've been. First I was here and then I was there. Maybe pick 3 checkpoints in your life, a job you've had, something that happened in your family. Connect those points to each other, right? It doesn't even have to be chronological. It doesn't have to be all job related, but people want to understand, how you've navigated life the way that you have that's unique to you or unique to whatever experience that you're talking about.
That's beautiful. Well, we've talked about the organizational DNA. We've talked about personas. We've talked about the story frames that can be used. What about the questions that we need to answer before we engage in messaging? Are there specific kinds of questions that are more useful than others when we're trying to communicate with an audience or craft a public relations plan to communicate with an audience?
One more technical, maybe to start with, is what is the digestibility of this message? We know who it's for, personas, and we know the voice that we're going to speak in, voice attributes, that's great, but really understanding where to go next, and will the audience actually see it? Will they engage with it? Will they click on it? So thinking through things like, what's your call to action? Are there too many calls to action? Are you asking someone to read something, then sign up? Always ask yourself, how can I simplify this even further? So for digestibility, oftentimes it's actually making the most impact in the smallest amount of space. It also could be making sure, can I say this in a graphic instead of so many words? The words that I do have, what reading level are they at? Because if it's a really, really complex subject, is it really going to resonate with prospective students if it's at a 20th grade reading level, for example? So how are we making this more accessible and as seamless as possible for it to be not only delivered directly to the audience, but in a way that they can engage with it and are excited to engage with it? So there's a lot of questions wrapped up into it. Another might be, has this been done before? If it has, go look at the outcomes, see how you can adapt accordingly. Have all the stakeholders, have you had stakeholders' eyes on this? Just, could it benefit from someone else actually reviewing from it and providing feedback? Actually, someone who represents the audience you're sending it to. Do you have sufficient stakeholder representation and inclusion? So lots of questions, of course, but it's one of those things where if you have the foundational elements like voice attributes, you have stakeholders that you're comfortable weaving into these conversations, it starts to become more normal, I think, to your process. And so that you're not necessarily hesitating, as much to hit publish or, send, if that makes sense.
It does. So, for example, you've spoken before about unique value propositions and how to differentiate ourselves from others as part of the mix of that persona and asking and crafting these questions. I imagine you have a lot to say about artificial intelligence and how we might use artificial intelligence in the future. But for our students who might be wary of it, who might be intimidated by the idea of using artificial intelligence to accomplish goals, what advice might you have for them that are trying to craft a public relations campaigns plan or trying to craft a great podcast episode? We want them to use these tools. What's your advice for using these kinds of artificial intelligence?
Great question. And I think first I want to ground that in something because, Ryan, not sure if you know this, but in my past life, I was an educational technology researcher. So technically, I've been writing about AI for many, many, many years. I think since 2011. And I've also been writing about tons of other technologies, extended reality, quantum, computing, all any technology that you can think of that would have implications in education. I've tried to understand its trajectory and its benefits and its potential impacts. And so I can tell you with complete confidence that of all the technologies that I've written about and researched throughout my career, AI is the one poised to make the biggest impact. Not talking tech for tech's sake or the latest shiny penny. It essentially is a technology that's ushering in a new era of how we get work done. And so what that means for a PR, marketing, or communications professional is that if we understand it as an enabling tool and not necessarily as a solution, it could be a really, really, really powerful and practical assistant. And what I mean by that is something like ChatGPT. You can feed into it your voice attributes, your unique value proposition, your personas, whatever other defining elements you have, even a news story, right, that you wrote, or a boilerplate about the brand, or some past social media posts, anything that would help ChatGPT or AI learn about the brand or the organization or the product. And once you've fed that to AI, it remembers it. It learns from it. And so when you ask it to take into account all those voice attributes, all the personas, and write a LinkedIn post targeted towards non-science teaching faculty about a science initiative, ChatGPT, AI, or whatever tool that you're using is going to be a lot more helpful to you. Now, I think the most important thing that PR professionals need to know about using AI is that it means that you need to become an even better editor, right? So there's a lot of discussion about, garbage in is garbage out. You need to be understanding the value of writing a good prompt. That means having ChatGPT or whatever tool you're using understand the voice, who the audience is, what style you want it written in, but that really paying attention to what the output is and giving it a really good editing eye. Some of these AI graphic tools, for example, we haven't necessarily matured where everything is appropriately licensed, right? So you might get an image that appears in an AI video you're making that you actually do not have a license to use in a business setting. And so understanding those implications is really important. I'm not saying we all need to become policy buffs overnight, but there does need to be a sense of guidelines, especially as it relates to intellectual property. University, are beacons of creating intellectual property, and they have their own avenues for licensing. And so those discussions need to be happening at a leadership level and at the individual creative level, just having a basic understanding, licensing and rights and attribution, and also really putting a good editing eye in whatever content is being yielded from these tools are going to be some of the most important skills in the next 1, 2, 5, 10 plus years.
And the speed at which it's all happening, right? I mean, the speed at which these tools are maturing give us pause for our trajectory of our own careers. So what advice do you have looking further into the future to say, we're using AI as these helpful tools ethically, of course. We're integrating them into our lives more and more every day. What are some of the things that we need to be aware of as someone who's studied technologies like this for so long?
Technology is a beautiful enabler, but not a solution. Ultimately, who's behind technology? People, right? And so I think no matter what technology comes our way and how AI grows and proliferates, professional and human skills will always be important. Critical thinking, higher order thinking, analysis, strategy, those are the types of skills that cannot be replaced overnight by a machine, by AI, though AI can help you really practically tell a better story, eliminate highly administrative tasks to make your life and your process a bit easier. Looking at it as something that can enable you is great, but if you also find anyone who is claiming to be an AI expert to sell you on whatever it is, no one is an AI expert right now. We're all learning as we go. Calling yourself an AI expert might be the equivalent of someone from 2005 to 2008 calling themselves a social media expert. Be wary of that, right? be wary of everything. Do question everything, but at the same time, don't be afraid to experiment. Get in there, start creating videos for fun, see where it leads.
I have in the past called myself a storytelling and AI expert, so I appreciate that.
You're lying, Brian. He's lying.
Conflict there because
No, I'm kidding. I kid.
I understand. The thing is, people are looking for guidance and advice from people like you to tell us about these AI tools and how to use them and what we can expect for our students. We want to prepare for the future, right? And what they need to know about these principles. And I think you've shared just a beautiful layout of issues to be aware of and the human value that cannot be replaced of not just as an editor or as a partner to AI, but as the driving force behind these very human relationships, which can lead to greater change and better campaign, better things like that. Can you speak a little bit about the connection between AI and relationships and social media? Because I know you are also an expert on social media and messaging strategies that work in social media. Can you speak a little bit?
Yes, I love social media. I love social media because it's really changed what it means to be a PR professional. And that excites me, right? Anyways, anytime an industry gets completely shaken up by a technology because of what that technology introduces or what it enables us to do, that's really exciting. So it's been, well over a decade now that news has been broken on social media, not necessarily, the evening, after clearing the dinner table, whatever it is. Anyone is empowered to break a story, tell a story, react to a story, and the stories you're telling are no longer one-way streets, right? You're not just getting published in an online or print newspaper and then maybe going to the comments section to see what people thought. Social media is a comment section, right? But what it also means is that you are continually competing on people's feeds. And you're not necessarily competing with who you think you're competing with, right? So as a university, for example, you're not necessarily competing with a different university. You're competing with the sandwich someone ate, a restaurant announcing a new menu, right? Like whatever other news is happening in the world. And so your message better be engaging enough to hold that space in someone's life for 7 seconds or however long it is. And also have them take the action that you need them to take, whether it's clicking to read more of the story, signing up for something, registering for something. And so making sure social media is baked in to your PR strategy is so important. And then we talked about personas and communities, but if you were to look at your brand's social media analytics, it might tell a different story of what your community looks like. So paying attention to who, for example, is who likes your LinkedIn brand page, who is more continually engaged with liking your post, for example, what time of day it seems to be getting more engagement. Those are all things to pay attention to. Social media is certainly more of a visual forum in many ways. At least the social media platforms that have sprung up in recent years have been almost entirely visual based. We have, of course, TikTok, we've got Instagram. And so for me in my own journey, in my own career, I was always so focused on writing in words. And I think that's still my first love. I'm once a poet, always a poet. But what's been so exciting for me is to start expanding and getting better at graphics, animation, video. Because if you can tell your story through video or through something that's less static, there is all kinds of evidence and data that suggests you have a better chance of it being seen. So I'm always looking for how can I tell it in a picture? How can I get this person on a video? Because also once you've created those assets for social media, they become assets that you can use for things like slide decks and presentations with executives and sales pitches and grants, or whatever it is. I very much subscribe to a design once, deploy everywhere philosophy. And it actually, oftentimes, if you design for social first, I find that it actually becomes easier to create content and stories for other forums.
That makes so much sense. I love that because you're getting more specific, you're getting more narrow, you're trying to communicate in less words. It's not about a longer form content. Usually it's that shorter, that more concise statement you're having to craft. And let's zoom back out here. And I know you talk about themes, for example. Some people call these pillars. these are things that do what specifically for a person who has a podcast, for a person who has a client, for a person who is just trying to communicate something cogent and cohesive and impactful on social media?
Yeah, it's all about authentic ways to connect to your communities. So like Ryan, your themes might be one of your themes might be friendly expert. At least that's one of the ways I see you now, right? I know I would never be as scared to approach you to ask you a question. I could always learn from you. And so if I were to use that as an example, I might encourage you, Ryan, how could you be more of a friendly expert on LinkedIn? For example, you taught me a really great tip the other day. What would that look like on LinkedIn to a larger audience? So I noticed that when you mandate someone, make sure you're posting, on your personal social media. It could feel like a huge drain and really daunting to people. But if you sort of position it like, what do you care about? What matters to you? And how can we make sure that you're telling the story of what matters to you and connecting it back to your work more prominently? It feels less daunting. And so if you actually develop those personal themes and relate them to how you're posting yourself, it actually, you might start to become more confident. And anytime you feel drained by something, you're automatically going to want to do it less and maybe step back from it. But if you feel more confident and if it feels more authentic to you, you're going to do it more. So I'm just not the type of person who is going to say, well, you need to be posting 2 times a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Your brand analytics might give you a better sense of when to post, but it's actually also about what feels most authentic to you and your community as well. So it doesn't have to be really prescriptive.
I like that takes the pressure off, because I think so many people, professionals and new professionals alike, experience that kind of pressure, right? And some of it comes back to what you were talking about before with imposter syndrome. I had a colleague who was saying that we won't hire you unless you tell us about your imposter syndrome, because if you don't have imposter syndrome, that's the thing that we want to red flag, right? Which I think speaks to this idea of feeling like an imposter on social media sometimes, because there are pressures to post just for the sake of posting, or the bad advice that you've seen that you just talked about out there that isn't like strategically thinking about themes and thinking about how to make sure that you're communicating a message effectively on behalf of your client, on behalf of your business. That seems like the big difference there. Are there other things that people need to know, that students or entrepreneurs need to know before they hit post? What are some other specific strategies they can use other than this idea of themes and strategic voice?
Okay. Well, sometimes it's just about being a good friend, since social media is a two-way street. So if you're not ready to post about yourself and your work yet, post about what your colleagues and friends are doing. Post about the work that excites you. Again, if you're a PR professional, is there some breaking news in the PR world that might resonate with your audience and community? Yes. If something excites you, chances are it might excite your community, your colleagues and friends too. And so, yeah, you definitely don't want to be the person on social who's only talking about yourself, because just like in real life, that could be quote unquote cringe, right? So start by actually looking at some of the people that you admire, what they're posting. How could you amplify their voices? What do you like about their post? What do you like about their voice? And let it sort of inform how you go about your own day and your own presence on social. And the other thing I'll say, only because it's one of the funniest memes I ever saw, but I did see a meme about a product that would allow you to transfer your imposter syndrome to someone who doesn't have it. And what a wonderful invention that would be. Just if you're not ready to dive in, just start keeping tabs or a list of the different voices on social that you admire, and pinpoint what you admire about those voices and see what you can bring into your own presence or how you might want to differentiate. And you don't need to feel pressure to post about everything, right? Just make sure that if you feel really, really, really excited about something, you're bursting at the seams, that you're sharing your story somehow.
That's such great advice. And I know our students and our entrepreneurs will embrace that idea of stepping into the void, because I think it is intimidating a lot of times.
Yeah, well, and also, I'll say this, right? I have done student internship programs. I work with contractors. So you better believe if someone's a prospect to collaborate with, I'm looking at their LinkedIn profiles, and if they are a grayed out avatar, okay, and this is for a communications role, then I might have some question marks. And this is not meant to scare anyone, but if you don't tell the story, someone else might invent one for you. And so, please, you hopefully use today as a springboard to start thinking about what story you really want to put out there, and think about even how to weave it into your personal bio.
I love that. And to make what is social personal, I think is a great tip for people who are struggling. We've talked a little bit about relationships, and I know that public relations professionals have to have the best relationships, the most authentic and trusting relationships to do their jobs. Can you speak also to the idea of listening and empathy and how those sorts of concepts play a role in crafting messages that will have an impact?
Well, generally, from the beginning to the end of a PR project, the number one thing you're doing is listening. When it's potentially interviewing, people for the story, it's listening and understanding what makes them tick, what outcomes something led to. It's also listening to the visions of maybe the partners involved. If it's, a partnered story, understanding the joint values, understanding, what the goals of the messaging are. It's great to send out a press release, but like, what are you hoping that press release generates other than good vibes and buzz, right? Is it students to sign up for a new program? Is it people to register for a new event series? And so actually listening to what the desired outcomes are, making sure the story and the messaging is aligning to whatever that desired outcome is. PR, a lot of times, is going hand in hand with growth marketing. So PR is an important strategy of generating revenue, growing a business, growing enrollment, whatever it is. And so PR actually has to be lockstep with business development, with marketing and communications. So again, stakeholder inclusion, making sure the right people are pulled into the conversation and that you're listening. An effective PR person in a situation will find a way to synthesize those vision, those goals and their needs, and make sure the story is engaging, but towards the direction of advancing that call to action. Am I making sense?
Absolutely. And I'm curious because you have so much deep experience with asking questions that I think could benefit both public relations professionals and podcasters and anyone who's doing interviews. You talk about listening for impact. Do you have some strategies to get to that impact whenever you're listening for impact and experts that you're interviewing aren't giving you what maybe you've seen in other research, or it's not aligning? We talk about alignment in public relations as one of the most important things. Whenever your qualitative, grounds up, grassroots research that you're spending so much time and effort in getting isn't aligning with those other impacts. Do you have any advice for overcoming that challenge?
Yeah. I think, again, it goes back to being a good editor, right? Oftentimes, if you're the PR person, you're at the table when something's being drafted. And so, you'll be able to have a say in how it materializes. And so if something's not aligning, you could call it out. Of course, it's a dream situation, but every PR professional knows that oftentimes you just get a press release and you have to do something with it sometimes, whether it's edit it, review it, send it on. And so I think if something doesn't feel aligned, getting people together on a call, don't underestimate the power of voice to voice versus asynchronously and attempting to do it through comments in a Google Doc or some other way. And just say, hey, I wanted to bring us all together to the same page. I have a few questions. Who is this impacting? How is it impacting them? How it will help you accomplish these goals that you stated in the memorandum of agreement or whatever else exists. But it's really important to do those things. And I find it can be really scary to do, to sort of put yourself in the middle there and do that. But I find if you can do it tactfully and openly and just say, I'm just looking to tell the most effective story possible, and get everyone on board that mission, they're going to appreciate you as a professional coming in and saying, hey, I think this may reflect your desired outcomes more based on what I just heard. Oftentimes, too, as a PR person, you're getting information from one source and then you're getting another set of information from another source. And it's possible that those sources aren't connecting. So just being that person who will bring those sources together, give them a space to talk it out, and then saying, okay, great. Now that I know the outcome of your conversation, I can update this messaging is part of why relationships matter so much. You gotta find a way to generate pull rather than pushing, right? And so what I mean by generating pull is people feeling comfortable coming to you and people feeling like you're safe with them, that you're not going to completely chop up their content or not listen to them. And so demonstrating active listening throughout and that you hear and understand them is so important.
It so is. I'm so glad to hear this because it's aligning, right? So alignment is a pain point among our professional entrepreneurs and public relations professionals. What are some other pain points? Bringing people together is a pain point sometimes because you've got to make sure that they're talking to each other in the same room synchronously, which is difficult sometimes to balance schedules. What are some other pain points that you experience as an entrepreneur working with these sometimes complex organizational institutions?
The first one that came to mind for some reason, Ryan, this is such a great question. And there are, pain points, of course, but not everything needs to be a press release. Let me say that one more time. Not everything needs to be a press release. Let's think about what a press release is. A press release is generally made to announce something that hasn't happened yet. Organizations have come together. A new initiative is announced. That's great. But I think what my pet peeve is when I'll see those press releases go out and then I'll never hear the outcomes of the project, of the initiative, of the part, whatever it is. But that's the story, right? What happens? What happens when these two organizations come together? When students get access to X, Y, or Z? And so I think when you are working on maybe the initial announcement, which I understand you got to get that announcement somehow out into orbit, really doubling down on what happens next, how this group is going to come together regularly and have a pulse for regular storytelling and understanding the outcomes that are story-worthy. So, let's say there's a new program. And because of this new program, 40% more students graduate. I don't know what it is, but that is an impressive story, right? And that is a story that's going to be more transformational across the field and change hearts and minds and inspire others versus just the announcement of the thing that hasn't happened yet. So focusing on the long game, I think, and starting with the long game and reverse engineering it, to the first step is super important. Another pain point is the value that's placed on marketing and PR professionals. It's one of those things where you see these memes, and I've heard other marketing professionals lament, like, everyone thinks they can do my job, right? Because it's just writing or just a post or it's just whatever it is. But when you ask the person, okay, you do it, there's silence. There's silence. It happens a lot because it actually turns out it's a lot harder than we think to write, find the image that goes with it, make the image that goes with it, make sure it aligns with the brand, make sure it's communicating with the right audience, right? It's pretty intricate and it's also pretty delicate. And so finding people, stakeholders, leaders within the organizations that understand the value of storytelling and understand the power and what goes into it is so important. I want to shout out Lev Gonick, who is the CIO of Arizona State University, who brought me in when I was an employee at ASU working as a comms lead for a department there. And he really understood the power of storytelling and saw it actually as a core function and strategy for that department. And as such, it really opened up a path for me as a storyteller and a communicator to do a lot, in a little bit of time and to, build a team and, take on new work. And so I think that there really needs to be a fundamental understanding at a leadership level of how storytelling can and will impact and shape an organization. It's used to promote funding, to promote thought leadership, to promote enrollment, to promote all kinds of growth, to promote community connections. And so, if we have any leaders of organizations or people that are decision makers or are in charge of strategic planning in some shape or form listening to this, please empower your storytellers and think about how storytelling fits in with your roadmap and your strategic plan.
And to make the case for storytelling even more important, right? We're built that way, right? Can you speak a little bit about how we're built to tell stories just on a fundamental level? And maybe that will help persuade any non-believers in storytelling who might be listening that they need to get on Team Story, right? I want that concise. You need to know how to tell great, better stories because, right?
Yes, you need to tell great, better stories because your organization and your reputation depends on it.
I love that. Your reputation depends on it. And the importance of reputation can't be undersold either, right? That's what public relations professionals are trying to work towards.
But all that's to say that, to go back to my point about if you don't tell your story, someone else might invent one. We all have reputations. And again, if your reputation is a grayed out avatar in LinkedIn, that's your reputation. Someone who is not involved or disengaged, right? So you sort of need to tell the story. You sort of need to think about the story you're silently telling and maybe use that as fuel to the fire to be more intentional about telling your story.
I love that. Can you tell us a little bit about your story of transformation? Because you told us about how you have written for AI. You told us about how you're helping these companies now, but tell us about your personal story of how you became an entrepreneur who is helping these institutions to actually tell stories that make an impact on the lives of students.
Okay, Ryan. The year is 2017. The organization I'm working for, called the New Media Consortium, where I was an educational technology researcher and writer and, director of communications. I come back from 6 months of maternity leave and it folds. It files for bankruptcy and the entire staff is let go, right? Including myself. It's Christmas and Hanukkah season, Ryan. So I am looking at seasonal work at the mall because it's 2017 and my family needs 2 incomes. I've just had a baby. So, fast forward to me frantically writing, I think, an email about looking for work and sending it to 10 people that I really admired in the field. And then those people, some of them writing back and saying, how soon can you start? Or yes, sure, I'd love to work with you, which really shows the power, I think, of relationships and being willing to just put yourself out there in a moment of vulnerability. And so honestly, Ryan, sometimes it's haphazard. I parlayed that into starting my own business. A week later, I had my S Corp. I had my business EIN. I did take a detour when one of those clients, Arizona State University, hired me to come on full time, which I did for 3 years, had my second kid, and it's just looking for greater flexibility and ownership of my day, right? Again, a little haphazard in that I just was ready for a change. I had at the time, a newborn and a 4.5-year-old, and just understanding that the 9 to 5 wasn't necessarily going to be what was best for me and my family. 9 to 5s are often accompanied by glass ceilings. I've been an endless table person, never a glass ceilings type of gal. So I just decided, let's just start building a table of my own and seeing what happens. So I really went full force back into my business in summer of 20, still working with ASU. So they became a client again, was, working with maybe one other organization or nonprofit too. I just started kind of putting myself out there. People I built relationships with on LinkedIn. I put an announcement out there that I was, leaving employment and I was excited for future possibilities. So just actually being vulnerable. I actually look back at some of my emails and my posts and I cringe at myself, right? Because they weren't perfect, maybe they sounded a little too vulnerable or maybe it was too much or I don't know. But the bottom line is I was obviously judging myself way harsher than maybe other people were. And maybe there were people judging my posts or my emails harshly, but clearly those aren't the people I'm working with today. It's the people who, saw that I had some space and what I was creating and were interested in collaborating. And those collaborations have turned into, long and fruitful partnerships now and relationships now. And it's really, really grown from there. And I just feel really, really grateful. But Ryan, I can't sit here and tell you that I planned this all from day one. And this was always the dream and always the goal. I think I always wanted to work for myself or have something, but a lot of times it was me figuring out who I am, what works for me, what doesn't, what I need. That really led to the decision that this is the path I'm on, and this is fulfilling me so much. And then just taking a leap of faith, right? Which I also want to say requires privilege, right? Oftentimes quitting a job means you're giving up insurance, other things that not everyone is in a position to do. There are financial implications. And so, it takes time, it takes intention, and it doesn't necessarily happen overnight. So sometimes it happens in desperate and vulnerable situations when you put yourself out there.
I think that story is going to help so many people who are going to struggle in the future if they want to start a business, especially. You have one piece of core advice for the entrepreneur, for that person who has not yet faced that challenge, that leap that you've taken. One core thing that they need to keep in mind and take away from this conversation.
Always bet on yourself. People are betting on AI. They're betting on the future of education, whatever. Bet on you. Whatever it takes for you to build that sense of confidence. It comes with building, a sense of community, saying yes to maybe as many experiences as you can at first so that you understand what's in your wheelhouse, what isn't, what works and what doesn't. But bet on yourself. Take that step. The people that you're meant to work with, you'll find each other. You really will. And the people who you're so worried about that you might embarrass yourself in front of that, you might not resonate with, that's okay. They'll do their thing, you'll do your thing, and you'll both be happy. What's so wrong with that?
That's a beautiful way to end our conversation. Sam, thank you so much for joining us, for taking the time to relate your wisdom to our future entrepreneurs and our public relations professionals and our podcasters and the students and the graduates who I know these stories will resonate with. Where can people find you online, Sam?
Oh, goodness. Please do find me online. My website is sabconsulting.org, so you could always contact me through there. But probably the best way is LinkedIn. I'm Samantha Adams Becker. 3 names, like an assassin. I'd be so happy to connect with you and to hear what you're up to. So please do connect.
Samantha Adams Becker, like an assassin. Another great.
Well, shout out to the other Sam Beckers who I've met in EdTech, because there are a few of us. So again, unique value proposition. I've got an Adams in the middle of that.
Excellent. Excellent. Awesome. Thank you again, Sam. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I appreciate the opportunity, and everyone have a great day.